That was video footage of former Congressman and first Palestinian member of Congress, Justin Amash, that he shared on X, formerly Twitter, of the aftermath of Israeli Defense Forces' deadly strike of a Christian Greek Orthodox church last week in Gaza. He confirmed several members of his family were killed, writing, it, quote, collapsed from an Israeli airstrike, killing multiple members of 3 connected Orthodox Christian families who are my relatives. They are my dad's first cousins and their spouses, children, and in-laws. May their memories be eternal. The IDF did take responsibility for launching the strike, but it maintains it was targeting a Hamas compound, not the church.
Amash confirmed the death of multiple family members Friday, a day after the bombing occurred, posting a picture of 2 relatives of his that were seeking shelter at the church, writing, quote, the Palestinian Christian community has endured so much. Our family is hurting badly. May God watch over all Christians in Gaza and all Israelis and Palestinians who are suffering, whatever their religion or creed. And then yesterday he shared another family member of his had been pulled from the rubble. His second cousin, George, just a baby. Amash wrote, quote, this beautiful baby committed no crimes, harmed no person. May his memory be eternal. Absolutely awful, perhaps making this conflict feel a little bit more real for Americans, that a former member of Congress sharing that he had relatives who have been killed by an IDF strike. Now, the Israeli forces say that they were targeting not the church specifically, a Hamas headquarters that was just next door. The strike hit a wall of the church that caused it to partly collapse, killing, I think we don't have the exact total yet. I've heard 16, 18. There could be more by the time they're done looking into it, obviously. Really, really horrible. And, of course, like, while Israel is obviously going to go after Hamas, you have to think, like, philosophically. Let's say there was, a murderer hiding in my apartment building and the police just blew up the apartment building to kill the person. I mean, no one would consider that legitimate, right?
No, I think they wouldn't. And I don't know. I haven't seen any reporting out about verifying that there was, in fact, a Hamas target. And so you also have to be sensitive to the idea that there might be a Hamas target nearby has been used to justify, in the eyes of so many Palestinians, any number of attacks that didn't even have that basic kernel of a foundation that might, in some people's eyes, justify this kind of a bombing. So
this is a problem with drone warfare, which is done in a very distant, passive way, where someone is just pressing a button. If you had, obviously there are also a lot of casualties and deaths of innocent bystanders that occurred during, full-scale invasions involving ground troops. But if they had to actually send in troops, you would use conventional weapons. Rather, you're more able to verify what the situation is on the ground rather than just distantly pressing a button and hitting something. Oops, we hit that too. I think it seems very unacceptable.
Yeah, and this, I think, is why public opinion is turning in the way that it has. When you look at the death toll going up, the events of October 7th were horrible, but that was the end of the Israeli death toll is still at that October 7th number, more or less. Whereas you have the death toll for Palestinians, including Palestinian children, just going through the roof. I think it's about 5,000 overall. Almost half of those are children. You see, not just to the extent that there is a dehumanization that happens with Palestinians, where they're less likely to be seen as equal they're more likely to be described in these terms like barbaric, et cetera, you've seen from so many IDF representatives and the like. When you see a former Congress member tweeting a picture of a baby covered in ash, we censored it here, but he tweeted out the uncensored version, being lifted from rubble, it feels very connected to an American experience. How much more American does it get than serving in Congress? So, I asked the question. I saw a number of other Congress members reaching out and expressing their sympathies, understandably so, but I couldn't help but notice that at least some of those representatives, I noticed Jamie Raskin in particular, were not one of the 13 representatives that were signatories on the progressive bill for immediate de-escalation and ceasefire that went out last week. They have only gotten 13. This is a little bit older. So maybe there's been more joining since. But when it was reported on initially, only 13 representatives had signed on to it. And so a part of me thinks that as tragic as it is, it really underscores how little public opinion has to do with the decisions that are being made in Congress.
I mean, you said a minute ago that the damage by the deaths attributable to Hamas's attack on October 7th have ended. I mean, in Israel's view, unless they deal with Hamas and get rid of Hamas, there will be more attacks and more terrorism in the future, which is not obviously to condone any specific action taken here. I think this is impossible to defend and tragic, and I wish that as they go about their attack on Hamas, they would try much harder to limit civilian casualties, or in fact to have a ceasefire and have some other way of getting the hostages back. I think the reality, though, is that Israel is in the view that Hamas, because of what they did on October 7th, has to be just systematically destroyed as an organization.
How do you do that? The problem is that
we're
Gaza,
watching how they do that.
Right, and it means killing a bunch of innocent people.
Right.
So is the international community going to say the war crimes are okay if Israel does it, that murdering civilians is okay if Israel does it? If that's the standard, that's the standard. But as we're seeing from the hundreds of thousands of people that were out protesting over the weekend, and the public opinion polls, which show that overwhelming majorities of Americans want there to be a ceasefire, I think it was 66% want there to be a ceasefire. It's a political non-starter, and I think raising some real interesting moral questions about our public support, our financial support as a country for what the state of Israel is doing. And I should also say, I understand that Israel's view, the Israeli government, I should say, their view is that this is just justified until Hamas is gone. The view of the people of Palestine is that it's not going to stop until they're no longer under occupation and are no longer forced to live in apartheid conditions. So to the extent that America is intervening, it has to engage in that moral question, not just what does retribution look like for Israel, but also what does equality look like for Palestine. The phrase "no justice, no peace" is supposed to speak to the idea that you can't just call for peace whilst one part of the population is still very much living under subjugation.
Well, right. But I don't think from Israel's point of view, it should not be viewed as retribution, because you're right, then it's just an eye for an eye. It's just indiscriminately killing people.
10 eyes for an eye.
It should be security, which is that no state would tolerate a terrorist group on its borders that periodically comes in and indiscriminately kills civilians.
Right, but the terrorist group, as we've discussed,
very naturally
that was put in power by the Prime Minister of Israel for the purpose of creating a justification for attacking Palestinians in exactly this way. At the same time this has been ongoing on the Gaza Strip, there have been a spike, escalating violence in the West Bank, where there is not Hamas, and the violence cannot be justified on those terms. A group of 3 masked settlers, those are Israelis who, of course, have been expanding these settlements in this region that it was supposed to be ostensibly Palestinian, but there's been this, what has been described as a colonial project of increasingly encouraging Israelis to go and to move to this land, to settle this land, and then to get engaged in skirmishes that justify growing and growing how much land Israel can claim and shrinking what Palestinians can claim. There have been these escalations, the New York Times reported on just a day or two ago, where 3 masked settlers killed Palestinians and then attacked the funeral procession for those Palestinians the next day and killed more people. This is the kind of thing that's happening. So I do think that we should really caution against the idea that once enough bombs have been dropped on Gaza, the conflict, the violence is going to be over, because Palestinians have been experiencing an ongoing campaign of violence for the last many, many, many decades. And that is what is fostering, feeding a group, like providing some kind of moral justification for people who might be inclined to join and support Hamas.
Well, I agree that peace feels very elusive in this part of the world, and that makes me even again, even less inclined to have our country and our government, naively thinking it's going to work out this time if we make the conflict broader and more involved in it. But we'll see if that sentiment ever reaches President Biden's ears. More Rising right after this.